There's nobody left in the cockpit. The words traveled through the cabin like a cold wind, and for a moment, 214 passengers forgot how to breathe. 30,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains, Flight 728 had been just another routine trip from Denver to Seattle. The seatbelt sign was off. People were watching movies, answering emails, finishing snacks, and counting down the hours until they got home. Then everything changed. A flight attendant hurried past row 17 with a look no passenger ever wants to see. Not annoyance, not stress, fear, real fear. Emily Carter looked up from the paperback resting in her lap. Most people would have missed it. The trembling hands, the forced smile, the way the attendant avoided eye contact with everyone around her. But Emily noticed. She always noticed. A few rows ahead, a baby began crying. Across the aisle, a businessman removed one earbud and frowned as another flight attendant disappeared behind the forward galley curtain. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, like the cabin itself had sensed something was wrong. Emily glanced out the window beside her. Bright afternoon sunlight reflected across an endless sea of white clouds. From the outside, everything looked peaceful. Inside, tension was beginning to spread. The overhead speakers crackled. Passengers instinctively looked up. No announcement came, just static. Then silence. The businessman beside Emily checked his watch. "That's strange," he muttered. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed toward the front of the aircraft. Another attendant rushed down the aisle. Then another. They were moving quickly now. Too quickly. Trying not to run. Failing. A teenager near row 12 pulled out his phone. A woman across the cabin whispered something to her husband. Questions began floating through the air. What's happening? Is there turbulence ahead? Did somebody get sick? Nobody had answers. At the front of the aircraft, the curtain shifted. For a brief second, Emily caught sight of the lead flight attendant, Rachel Moore. Her face was pale. Her eyes looked glassy, and then she disappeared again. Emily quietly closed her book. Around her, passengers continued, speculating. Most assumed it was a minor issue. A delayed announcement. A medical situation. Nothing serious. Human beings were good at convincing themselves everything was fine, especially when they were trapped inside a metal tube moving nearly 500 miles per hour 6 miles above the earth. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The silence from the cockpit became impossible to ignore. Commercial pilots regularly updated passengers. They announced weather conditions, arrival times, turbulence reports. But now there was nothing. No voice. No reassurance. Just growing uncertainty. The overhead speakers clicked again. Every conversation stopped instantly. A woman near the emergency exit gripped her armrest. A young father looked up from his daughter's coloring book. The cabin fell completely silent. Rachel's voice finally came through, but it didn't sound like the calm, practiced voice passengers expected. It sounded strained, controlled, like someone holding back panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, pausing for a fraction too long. "Please remain seated. We ask for your patience while our crew addresses an unexpected situation." Then the announcement ended. No explanation, no details, just silence once again. The businessman beside Emily laughed nervously. That doesn't sound good. No one laughed with him. Up front, another crew member emerged from the galley. Emily watched as the woman wiped tears from the corner of her eye before quickly looking away. That was when Emily stood up. Not suddenly, not dramatically, calmly, deliberately, like someone who had already made a decision. Several passengers turned toward her. They didn't know why. Neither did the businessman beside her. But something about the look in Emily Carter's eyes made him stop speaking. She reached up, removed her headphones, and looked toward the front of the aircraft. Somewhere beyond that locked cockpit door, something had gone terribly wrong. And within the next few minutes, every person on Flight 728 would learn why the quiet young woman from row 17 was the last person on board they should have underestimated. 3 hours earlier, Denver International Airport moved with its usual rhythm of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and travelers rushing toward departure gates. Emily Carter sat quietly near gate C-27, a paper cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched people hurry past. She wore a gray sweatshirt, blue jeans, and simple sneakers. Nothing about her appearance attracted attention. That was exactly how she preferred it. Across from her, a group of business travelers discussed quarterly reports and upcoming meetings. Nearby, a young family tried to keep two energetic children entertained before boarding. Everyone carried their own concerns, their own schedules, their own destinations. Emily simply listened. Years of experience had taught her that people revealed far more than they intended when they believed nobody was paying attention. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Passengers immediately stood and formed a line. Emily waited until the crowd thinned before gathering her backpack and joining the end. As she approached the gate scanner, a man in an expensive navy suit stepped in front of her without looking back. His carry-on bag nearly struck her shoulder. "Sorry," he said automatically, though his tone suggested he was not actually sorry. Emily offered a polite nod. The man glanced at her boarding pass. "Row 17, he asked casually. "Looks like we are on the same flight." "Looks that way," Emily replied. "Hopefully they get us there on time," he said. "I have a very important meeting tomorrow morning." Emily smiled faintly. "I am sure they will do their best." The businessman chuckled. "That is easy to say when your entire week does not depend on one flight." He moved forward before she could answer. Emily simply continued walking. By the time she reached her seat, she had nearly forgotten the conversation. Row 17 sat slightly behind the wing. Not the most desirable location, but it offered a clear view of the horizon once the aircraft reached cruising altitude. Emily placed her backpack beneath the seat and settled in beside the window. A few minutes later, the businessman appeared again. He stopped in the aisle and laughed softly. "Well, look at that. Same row." He occupied the aisle seat across from her. Small world. Emily nodded politely and returned to her book. The man spent the next several minutes making phone calls, discussing investments, contracts, and deadlines. His voice carried throughout the cabin. Several passengers exchanged irritated looks. He either did not notice or did not care. Meanwhile, the flight crew completed their preparations. Lead flight attendant Rachel Moore moved confidently through the cabin, greeting passengers and helping stow luggage. Her professionalism immediately stood out. Emily noticed small details others missed. Rachel checked each overhead bin personally. She greeted nervous travelers with reassurance. She maintained constant awareness of the cabin around her. It was the behavior of someone who took responsibility seriously. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate. Engines hummed to life. Passengers settled into their seats as the safety demonstration began. The businessman ignored it entirely. Most people did. Emily did not. Her eyes followed every instruction, every procedure, every exit location. Habit. Nothing more. Or at least that was what it appeared to be. As Flight 728 climbed into the afternoon sky, sunlight poured through the windows and painted the cabin in gold. The city of Denver gradually disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds. Around her, passengers relaxed. Laptops opened. Movies started. Conversations resumed. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet if anyone had looked closely at Emily Carter during those first quiet minutes of the flight, they might have noticed one unusual thing. While everyone else focused on where they were going, Emily occasionally glanced toward the cockpit door. Not with concern, not with curiosity, with recognition, as though part of her attention never truly left the front of the aircraft. For the next 20 minutes, the flight remained uneventful. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude and settled into the familiar rhythm of commercial air travel. Soft conversations blended with the hum of the engines. Flight attendants rolled beverage carts down the aisle. Sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the clouds outside into endless fields of white and gold. Most passengers had relaxed completely. The businessman across from Emily was reviewing a presentation on his laptop. Two college students a few rows ahead were watching a comedy movie and trying not to laugh too loudly. A little girl near the front proudly showed her coloring book to anyone willing to look. Everything appeared normal. Yet Emily noticed something unusual. It started with the seatbelt sign. It illuminated briefly without explanation, then switched off again less than a minute later. Most passengers ignored it. Emily did not. A few moments later, the aircraft made a slight course correction. Nothing dramatic, just enough for someone experienced to notice. Emily slowly closed her book and looked toward the front of the cabin. The cockpit door remained shut. That was normal. The atmosphere around it was not. Rachel Moore emerged from the forward galley carrying a tray. She smiled at passengers as she walked by, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. When she reached the middle of the cabin, she paused briefly and exchanged a look with another flight attendant. It lasted less than a second. Still, Emily caught it. Concern. Genuine concern. The second attendant immediately disappeared toward the cockpit. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The beverage service slowed. Rachel checked her watch twice within a single minute. Another unusual detail. Professional flight attendants rarely displayed nervous habits in front of passengers. The businessman finally noticed something as well. The crew seems tense, he said while adjusting his glasses. Emily glanced toward the galley. Maybe they are dealing with something. Hopefully not weather, he replied. I hate turbulence. Emily did not answer. Her attention remained fixed on the front of the aircraft. A chime sounded overhead. Several passengers looked up automatically. No announcement followed. The silence felt heavier this time. Rachel appeared again, moving quickly toward the cockpit. She knocked once, waited, knocked again. Then she entered a security code on the access panel beside the door. Emily watched carefully. The door did not open. Rachel tried again. Still nothing. For the first time, the flight attendant's calm expression cracked. Just slightly. Just long enough. She immediately looked around to ensure nobody had noticed. Most passengers were distracted by screens, books, or conversations. Emily noticed. Another 10 minutes passed. The cabin no longer felt relaxed. Passengers sensed that something was wrong even if they could not explain why. Human instincts often recognize tension before logic could identify the cause. The college students stopped watching their movie. The little girl stopped coloring. Even the businessman had abandoned his presentation. Then the cockpit intercom clicked. Every head turned toward the speakers. A voice began to speak, then abruptly cut off after a burst of static. The silence that followed felt louder than any announcement. Rachel hurried through the curtain and disappeared once more. This time she did not come back immediately. Minutes dragged by. The aircraft continued flying smoothly through clear skies, but uncertainty spread from row to row like an invisible current. Emily glanced out the window. The horizon remained steady. The engines sounded normal. The airplane itself was fine. Whatever was happening was not outside the aircraft. It was inside. And judging by the increasingly worried expressions on the faces of the crew, the situation was becoming more serious with every passing minute. The answer arrived 15 minutes later. Rachel Moore stepped into the aisle and stopped near the center of the cabin. She was trying to appear calm, but everyone could see the strain in her face now. Conversations faded one by one until only the sound of the engines remained. More than 200 passengers looked toward her, waiting. Rachel took a breath. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing an operational issue. The aircraft remains stable and there is no immediate danger. However, we ask that everyone remain seated while our crew works through the situation. The wording was careful. Too careful. Passengers immediately understood she was not telling them everything. Questions erupted across the cabin. What kind of issue? What is happening? Why has nobody from the cockpit spoken? Rachel raised a hand politely. Please remain calm. We will provide updates as soon as possible. Then she turned and hurried back toward the front. The reaction was immediate. People began whispering. Phones appeared. Some passengers attempted to connect to onboard messaging services. Others stared nervously toward the cockpit door. The businessman across from Emily leaned forward. That was not turbulence. No, Emily replied quietly. It was not. Minutes later, the forward curtain opened again. This time, Rachel approached a man seated in first class. She spoke to him briefly before leading him toward the cockpit. Hope spread through the cabin almost instantly. Maybe he was another pilot. Maybe everything was under control. The passengers watched him disappear behind the curtain. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The aircraft continued flying smoothly through clear skies. Yet the tension only grew. Finally, the man returned. The difference in his expression shocked everyone. When he had walked forward, he looked confident. Now he looked pale. Rachel escorted him back to his seat. He sat down without speaking. A woman beside him immediately asked what was happening. The man slowly shook his head. I cannot help them, he said. The words traveled farther than he intended. Several nearby passengers heard him. Then several more. Within moments, the entire cabin knew. The first source of hope had failed. Emily watched Rachel disappear behind the curtain once again. This time, the flight attendant remained out of sight for nearly 20 minutes. When she finally returned, her professional composure was gone. Not completely, but enough. Her eyes moved quickly across the rows as though searching for something. Or someone. She stopped near row 10. then row 14, then farther back. Emily already knew what was coming before Rachel spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin, "we are looking for anyone with significant flight experience. Commercial, military, cargo, private aviation. If you have advanced training, please identify yourself immediately." The cabin froze. Every passenger understood the meaning behind the request. This was not a routine problem. This was not a minor inconvenience. Something had happened inside the cockpit. The businessman slowly lowered his laptop. The college students exchanged nervous glances. Even the little girl near the front stopped coloring. Nobody stood. Nobody spoke. Rachel waited several seconds, then several more. The silence felt endless. Emily looked toward the front of the aircraft. Her expression never changed. Around her, fear was beginning to take hold. But Emily Carter was not afraid. She was thinking, calculating, listening. And when Rachel prepared to ask the question a second time, Emily quietly closed her book, removed her headphones, and rose from seat 17A. Every eye in the cabin followed Emily as she stepped into the aisle. For a moment, nobody spoke. The sudden movement seemed almost unreal after so many minutes of uncertainty and fear. Rachel Moore turned toward her immediately. Relief flashed across the flight attendant's face, but it disappeared just as quickly when she realized who had stood up. Emily looked young, younger than most people expected. She carried no visible signs of authority, no uniform, no credentials hanging around her neck. Just a woman in a gray sweatshirt standing quietly in row 17. Rachel approached her. "Do you have flight experience?" she asked. Emily nodded once. "Yes." Several passengers leaned closer. The businessman across the aisle frowned. "How much experience?" Rachel asked. Emily glanced briefly toward the cockpit before answering. "Enough to help." The response did not inspire confidence. Murmurs spread through nearby rows. One passenger shook his head. Another crossed his arms skeptically. The businessman stood halfway from his seat. "Wait a second," he said. "That is not exactly reassuring." Emily remained calm. Rachel studied her face. "Can you be more specific?" she asked quietly. Before Emily could answer, a voice came from 3 rows ahead. "I can help too." Heads turned instantly. A middle-aged man in a sports jacket stood up and raised his hand. "I have flown airplanes before." Hope immediately returned to the cabin. The man looked confident. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being listened to. Rachel hurried toward him. "What kind of aircraft?" she asked. "Single-engine planes," he replied. "I have logged several hundred hours." Several passengers visibly relaxed. Even the businessman seemed encouraged. "That sounds better," he said. Rachel hesitated only briefly before leading the man toward the front of the aircraft. Emily remained standing for a few seconds before quietly returning to her seat. Nobody paid much attention to her anymore. The cabin's hopes were now focused entirely on the volunteer heading toward the cockpit. Minutes passed. The atmosphere changed again. At first, people waited patiently. Then anxiety slowly returned. 10 minutes later, the forward curtain moved. The volunteer emerged. One look at his face told the entire story. His confidence was gone. His shoulders sagged. Rachel walked beside him, speaking softly. The man returned to his seat without making eye contact with anyone. "What happened?" a passenger asked immediately. The volunteer exhaled slowly. "I fly small aircraft," he admitted. "What is happening up there is beyond my training." The hope that had briefly filled the cabin vanished. Some passengers lowered their heads. Others stared silently at the floor. A few began whispering worriedly among themselves. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment before straightening her posture and turning back toward the cabin. She looked exhausted now. Determined, but exhausted. Her gaze moved slowly across the rows once more. This time it stopped on Emily. Rachel walked directly to row 17. Neither woman spoke immediately. The surrounding passengers watched in complete silence. Finally, Rachel asked the same question again, but her voice sounded different now. Less doubtful, more hopeful. "How much experience do you really have?" Emily looked toward the cockpit door, then back at Rachel. "Enough that you should take me up there right now." The passengers nearest row 17 exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody knew what to make of Emily Carter anymore. A few minutes earlier, she had been just another traveler reading a book by the window. Now she was speaking with a level of confidence that seemed completely out of place given the situation. The businessman stared at her. "That is not an answer," he said. "What exactly does that mean?" Emily met his eyes calmly. It means every minute matters. Rachel looked from Emily to the anxious faces surrounding them. She was caught between procedure and necessity. Under normal circumstances, nobody would allow a passenger near the cockpit. These were not normal circumstances. I need more than that, Rachel said quietly. If I bring you forward, I need to know who you are. Emily hesitated for the first time, not because she was uncertain, because she seemed to be deciding how much to reveal. Around them, the cabin remained silent. Even passengers several rows away were listening now. Finally, Emily reached into her backpack. The simple motion drew every eye in sight. She removed a slim leather wallet and opened it. Rachel accepted the identification card inside. Her eyes moved across the information once. Then she looked again, this time more slowly. The color drained from her face. You are a pilot? Rachel asked. Emily nodded. Yes. The businessman leaned farther into the aisle. A pilot of what? Emily did not answer him directly. Rachel continued reading. Her hands trembled slightly. Commercial transport certification, she whispered. Multi-engine jet rating. The passengers nearest them exchanged confused glances. Most had no idea what those qualifications meant. Rachel did. She kept reading. Then her eyes widened further. Former United States Air Force flight test program? She asked. Emily nodded again. The silence became absolute. Rachel looked as though she had suddenly discovered a completely different person sitting in seat 17A. How many flight hours? She asked. Just over 4,300, Emily replied. Nobody spoke. The businessman blinked twice. 4,300? Emily remained calm. Approximately. The number seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman they had been sitting beside for the past several hours. She did not look like the image most people carried in their minds when they imagined a pilot responsible for advanced aircraft. That realization was visible on several faces throughout the cabin. Emily noticed it. She simply ignored it. Rachel handed back the identification. Her expression had completely changed. Doubt was gone. Respect had replaced it. Why did you not say something sooner? She asked. Emily glanced toward the cockpit door. Because you had another volunteer. I hoped he could help. Rachel almost laughed from relief. Almost. Instead, she took a steadying breath. Come with me. The businessman stood halfway from his seat again. This time his voice sounded very different. Wait, he said. You can actually fly this airplane? Emily picked up her backpack. I can try to help the people already fighting to keep everyone safe. Then she stepped into the aisle. Nobody attempted to stop her. Nobody questioned her credentials again. As Rachel guided her toward the front of the aircraft, passengers turned in their seats to watch her pass. Some looked hopeful. Others looked stunned. A few simply stared. Emily ignored every gaze. Her focus remained fixed on the cockpit door ahead. Because while the passengers had just learned who she was, Emily already understood something far more important. Whatever was happening behind that door was serious enough that a trained flight crew had been unable to solve it alone. And in a matter of seconds, she was about to find out exactly how serious it had become. The cockpit door opened, and Emily immediately understood why the crew had been so desperate. The aircraft itself was stable. The instruments were functioning. The autopilot remained engaged. Yet the atmosphere inside the flight deck felt completely different from the calm cabin outside. Two crew members were focused on managing communications and monitoring systems while coordinating with air traffic control. Multiple radio channels carried overlapping instructions and updates. Rachel stepped aside as Emily entered. One of the crew members looked up. You are the pilot? The question was not rude. It was simply surprised. Emily handed over her credentials. The reaction was immediate. The man scanned the information once and straightened in his seat. Captain Emily Carter, he said quietly. Flight test program? Emily nodded. Former Air Force. Commercial. Certified afterward. He handed the identification back without another question. Experience recognized experience. No explanations were necessary. Emily moved closer to the instrument panel. Her eyes traveled across the displays. Airspeed. Altitude. Navigation. Fuel status. Engine performance. Weather radar. She absorbed the information with remarkable speed. Years of training revealed themselves not through dramatic speeches, but through tiny details. She did not rush. She did not panic. She looked exactly like someone standing in a familiar environment. What is our current situation? She asked. The crew member immediately began explaining. Air traffic control had already cleared priority routing. Several airports were available. Weather conditions were acceptable along most routes. The aircraft remained mechanically sound. Emily listened carefully. Then she asked 3 precise questions in rapid succession. Each one focused on information nobody else had mentioned. Wind conditions, runway length options, fuel balance projections. The crew exchanged brief looks. The questions told them everything they needed to know. This woman understood exactly what she was doing. Outside the cockpit, passengers remained frozen in uncertainty. Inside, something important had changed. For the first time since the crisis began, the conversation sounded organized, focused, professional. Emily studied the weather display again. Her expression tightened slightly. That could become a problem, she said. The crew member leaned closer. A storm system had begun developing near the airport that offered the fastest route. Nothing dangerous yet, but conditions were changing. Air traffic control confirmed the same information moments later. Emily listened to the radio traffic through a headset. Pilots from other aircraft were reporting increasing cloud buildup and shifting winds. The situation remained manageable. For now, Rachel watched from the doorway. She could not understand every technical detail being discussed, but she understood something far more important. The uncertainty that had dominated the cockpit was disappearing. Not because Emily was performing miracles, because she was bringing structure to confusion. One decision at a time, one problem at a time. Emily removed the headset briefly and looked toward the cabin beyond the cockpit door. More than 200 people were waiting behind that barrier. Families, children, business travelers, students, people with plans for tomorrow, people who had trusted strangers to carry them safely through the sky. Then she turned back to the instruments. Air traffic control transmitted another update. The weather ahead was deteriorating faster than expected. The nearest suitable airport remained available, but the margin for delay was shrinking. Emily adjusted her headset and spoke calmly. Then we stopped discussing options. The cockpit became silent. We commit to a destination now. The crew member nodded. Air traffic control waited for the decision. Emily looked at the weather display one final time. The next phase had arrived. And unlike the passengers who had just learned who she was, the professionals around her were beginning to realize something even more significant. Captain Emily Carter was no longer helping with the situation. She was leading it. The decision was made within seconds. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft toward an airport nearly 100 miles ahead, where emergency crews were already preparing for arrival. It was not the closest option, but it offered the longest runway and the best support resources. Under ordinary circumstances, the choice would have been simple. Unfortunately, the weather was no longer ordinary. Emily studied the radar display as patches of yellow and red slowly expanded across the screen. The storm system had accelerated. Winds were shifting. Cloud layers were thickening. Conditions remained within safe operating limits, but the margin for error was shrinking. We need to begin our descent now, Emily said. The crew member beside her nodded and relayed the request. Moments later, the aircraft started descending from cruising altitude. In the cabin, passengers immediately felt the subtle change. Conversations stopped. Window shades lifted. People looked outside searching for answers hidden among the clouds. Rachel made another announcement. Her voice sounded steadier now. Ladies and gentlemen, we are diverting to an alternate airport as a precaution. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions. The wording was calm, but everyone understood the truth. This was no routine diversion. Back in the cockpit, Emily continued scanning instruments. Every reading mattered. Every update mattered. Airspeed remained stable. Fuel reserves remained acceptable. Navigation systems were functioning normally. Then a warning indicator illuminated briefly before disappearing again. Emily noticed it immediately. Did you see that? She asked. The crew member nodded. A sensor had reported an intermittent issue connected to one of the aircraft systems. Nothing critical. Not yet. But combined with deteriorating weather, it introduced another layer of complexity. Air traffic control transmitted updated wind information. Emily listened carefully. The crosswinds had increased. Not dangerous, just challenging. The kind of conditions that demanded concentration and discipline. She adjusted several settings and reviewed the approach procedures. Her movements remained calm and deliberate. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Rachel watched from behind the cockpit seats. The transformation still amazed her. Less than an hour earlier, Emily had been sitting quietly by a window reading a novel. Now she sounded exactly like every experienced Captain Rachel had ever flown with. Outside, clouds surrounded the aircraft. Sunlight disappeared. The bright afternoon sky gave way to shades of gray. Light rain streaked across the windshield. The runway remained dozens of miles away, hidden beyond layers of weather and distance. Air traffic control cleared the flight for final approach preparations. Emily acknowledged the transmission and reviewed the checklist one more time. The crew followed her lead without question. Trust had replaced uncertainty. Confidence had replaced fear. Yet Emily knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Flying an aircraft safely through clear skies required skill. Bringing one down smoothly when weather, pressure, and hundreds of lives depended on every decision required something more. Focus, experience, discipline. The runway lights finally appeared on the navigation display. The airport was close now. Very close. The aircraft continued descending through the clouds as rain tapped steadily against the windshield. Behind them sat more than 200 passengers waiting for an outcome they could not control. Ahead lay a narrow strip of pavement surrounded by storm-dark skies. Emily tightened her headset, adjusted her grip on the controls, and fixed her eyes on the approach path. The final test had begun. The runway emerged from the rain like a distant ribbon of light. For the first time since the crisis began, everyone in the cockpit could actually see their destination. The aircraft continued descending steadily through low clouds as air traffic control cleared them for landing. Emily's eyes never left the instruments for long. Every few seconds, she shifted her attention between the runway environment, weather updates, and the aircraft's performance. The crosswinds remained strong. Rain continued falling. But the situation was no longer deteriorating. It was stabilizing. One decision at a time. One correction at a time. Behind the cockpit door, passengers sat in complete silence. Nobody was watching movies anymore. Nobody was working. Nobody was sleeping. Families held hands. Travelers stared through rain-covered windows. Even the businessman who had doubted Emily earlier remained motionless, his eyes fixed toward the front of the cabin. Rachel moved quietly through the aisles, performing final safety checks. She noticed something remarkable. Fear was still present, but panic was gone. Somehow, knowing that someone capable was at the controls had changed everything. Back in the cockpit, the runway lights grew larger. Emily listened carefully as air traffic control provided the latest wind report. The numbers were challenging, but manageable. She acknowledged the transmission and adjusted the approach. The crew member beside her watched in admiration. Every movement was calm. Every instruction was precise. There was no dramatic speech. No display of ego. Just competence. The kind that only comes from years of discipline and experience. At 1,000 feet above the ground, the runway sat directly ahead. At 500 feet, rain streaked across the windshield. At 200 feet, the aircraft remained perfectly aligned. Nobody spoke unnecessarily. There was nothing left to say. The final moments belonged to focus. Then came the sensation every passenger had been waiting for. The wheels met the runway. Smoothly, confidently. The aircraft rolled forward through the rain as reverse systems engaged and speed gradually decreased. For a second, nobody reacted. It was as if the cabin needed time to believe what had just happened. Then applause erupted. Loud, sustained, emotional. Passengers smiled. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply leaned back and exhaled for the first time in nearly an hour. Rachel stood near the front of the cabin and smiled as relief washed across her face. Outside, emergency vehicles escorted the aircraft toward a secure parking area. Inside, the atmosphere had completely transformed. People who had been strangers a short time earlier now exchanged grateful looks and quiet conversations. When the aircraft finally stopped, another round of applause filled the cabin. Yet Emily remained exactly as she had been throughout the entire flight. Calm, composed, unassuming. She completed a few final tasks, thanked the crew, and prepared to leave. As passengers began exiting, many looked around searching for her. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted to shake her hand. A few simply wanted to say thank you. But Emily slipped quietly into the moving crowd. Near the terminal entrance, the businessman finally caught up with her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I thought I knew who you were." Emily smiled softly. Most people did. The man laughed and shook his head. You saved every person on that airplane. Emily adjusted her backpack strap and looked toward the busy terminal beyond. The crew never stopped doing their jobs, she said. I was just one part of the solution. Then she continued walking. A little girl from the flight watched her disappear into the crowd and tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mom, she whispered, that lady is a hero. Her mother smiled. Yes, she said, but the amazing thing is that she never needed anyone to know it.